The order came to me in writing, on a single card, sealed with wax the color of dried blood, and it said only this: walk every stone. I read it twice in the guardroom light before I understood that Princess Adela had signed it herself, in a hand so small and firm it looked less like a signature than a scar. I am Thomas Renwick. For 19 years I have stood the posts of the royal House of Harrowgate, and in 19 years I had never once received an order from the king's own sister that did not pass first through the master of the guard, through the duty officer, through 3 sets of hands that existed precisely so that a warrant officer like me would never hold a princess's private wishes in his bare fingers. Yet there it was, walk every stone, and beneath it smaller, you. Alone at first, tell no one the shape of it. I did not sleep that night. A man who has stood still for 19 years learns to read the temperature of a house the way a farmer reads a sky, and the House of Harrowgate had been running a fever for weeks. Doors that had always stood open were closed. The Queen Consort's people moved through corridors that were not theirs. And twice, I will swear to this before any court, twice I had felt, standing my post outside the West Gallery in the dead hours, the unmistakable sense that the silence around me was not empty, that someone somewhere was listening to it. So when Princess Adela's card said walk every stone, I did not think she was mad. I thought she had felt the same fever, and that she had chosen me because a warrant officer with 19 unblemished years and no ambitions is the one man in a palace whom no one bothers to watch. She received me the next morning in the small study that had been her late sister-in-law's, Queen Isolde's room, they still called it, though Isolde had been dead 4 years and her portrait now hung in shadow. Adela was not a soft woman. The king's sister had a face made for winter, all clean lines and level eyes, and she did not waste warmth on formalities. You read my card, she said. It was not a question. I walked every stone from the north stair to the chapel last night, Your Highness, in my head. I have not yet walked them with my hands. Something moved at the corner of her mouth that in a warmer woman might have become a smile. Good. Then you understand what I am asking. I understand the words, I said. I would be a poor servant if I pretended to understand the reason. She rose and went to the window. Below us the forecourt lay gray under a low sky, and the ceremonial guard stood their posts in a line as straight as a ruled page, and none of them knew that above their bearskins a princess was about to hand a warrant officer the most dangerous instruction of his life. 4 days ago, Adela said, I spoke to my brother in this room, the king. I spoke to him about the succession, about matters that touch the safety of his children, about names I will not repeat to you yet. We were alone. The door was locked. I checked it myself. She turned. 2 days later, a decision was made against the very thing I had argued for, made by people who were not in this room, who could not have been in this room, and who nonetheless answered my private arguments point by point as though they had been sitting at my elbow. The cold that went through me then was not fear exactly. It was recognition. It was the feeling of a suspicion you have carried alone suddenly finding a witness. You think you were overheard, I said. I think this house has ears it was not born with. She came back to the desk and set both hands flat upon it, and for the first time I saw that the level eyes were not calm at all. They were holding still the way a drawn bowstring holds still. I have served the crown my whole life, Renwick. I have kept its secrets and buried its griefs. I know the sound of a palace that keeps confidence. This one has stopped keeping it, and I will not go to the master of the guard because I do not know who the master of the guard reports to when the doors are closed. I will not go to the king because I will not put a suspicion I cannot prove into the mouth of a man who loves the woman I suspect. I am going to you. You will walk every stone. And if there is something buried in the walls of this house that should not be there, you will find it, and you will bring it to me, and to no one else. And if I find nothing, then I am a foolish old woman jumping at drafts, she said, and you will have my thanks and my silence, and we will never speak of this again. She straightened. But you will find something. I have felt it the way you have felt it. I saw it in your face the moment you walked through that door. I could not deny it, so I did not. How long do I have? I asked. The state reception is in 11 days. Half the court, ambassadors, the press behind their ropes. If this house is leaking, it will leak loudest then, and I want it sealed before it does. She picked up a second card from the desk and held it out. On it was written a single word and a single number, Subcellar 9. Start low, she said. Rot rises from the bottom of a house. And Renwick, the cellars are the queen consort's charge now. She reordered them last winter, new locks, her own men on the keys. If I am right about anything, I am right about that. I took the card. I remember the weight of it, which was nothing, and the weight of what it meant, which was everything. I will need a reason to be down there, I said. A warrant officer does not wander the subcellars without one, and if I am seen, questions follow. You will have a reason. She allowed herself the winter version of a smile at last. As of this hour, by my order, there is a full security sweep of the palace ahead of the reception. Damp survey. Wiring survey. Fire risk in the old vaults. Perfectly ordinary. Perfectly boring. Every man will roll his eyes at it. You will be one of a dozen tradesmen and guardsmen crawling this house with clipboards for the next 11 days, and no one will look twice at the one of you who is actually looking. She held my eye. Hide the sweep inside the sweep. That is the whole art of it. Now go and find me my ears. I went. I will tell you what the subcellars of Harrowgate are, because you cannot understand what came after without standing where I stood. The palace above is all gilt and glass and portraits, a place built to be seen. But every great house is a body, and beneath the skin there is bone, and the bone of Harrowgate is stone, cellar upon cellar sunk 3 floors below the forecourt, vaulted and cold, some of them older than the throne itself. In the deepest of them the air does not move. The temperature holds at the same grave chill winter and summer alike. Lamps hang far apart, so that a man walks from pool of light to pool of light through long reaches of dark, and his own footsteps come back to him off the far wall a half-second late, like a companion who cannot keep step. Subcellar 9 sat at the very foot of the West Range, directly. I worked this out with a plumb line and a floor plan over the next 3 days, directly beneath the small study, where Princess Adela had spoken her private words to the king. Directly beneath Queen Isolde's old room. That was not a coincidence, but I get ahead of myself. I began, as she had told me, with a clipboard and a lie. The sweep gave me my cover, and I used it well. For the first 2 days I was the most diligent, most tedious surveyor the House of Harrowgate had ever suffered. I measured damp. I logged wiring. I filled 3 pages with the fire risks of the old vaults, and I made certain that the right people saw me filling them. I was slow. I was boring. I was invisible. And under the boredom I looked. A palace, if you have never lived in one, is full of the honest clutter of centuries, pipes and conduits and bell wires and the ghosts of gas lines, layer upon layer, each generation running its own veins through the old stone and never quite pulling out the last. To find one wire that should not be there in a house webbed with wires that should, you cannot look for the wire. You will go blind and mad. You must look for the wrong, the new solder on the old joint, the dust disturbed where dust should lie thick, the screw whose slot is bright when its brothers are dulled, the patch of mortar a half-shade paler, a half-year younger than the wall it hides in. I had learned to look for the wrong a long time before I ever came to Harrowgate, in a life I do not speak of, in service that the card in my breast pocket did not know about, and Princess Adela did not know about, and I intend to leave mostly where it lies. It is enough to say this. Before I stood still for a living, I had spent years being the kind of man who was sent into places to find what other men had hidden there. I had put my own hands on more than one device meant to carry a voice out of a room where no voice was supposed to leave. I knew the trade from the other side of it. When Princess Adela chose the invisible warrant officer, she chose better than she knew. On the 3rd day, in the far corner of Subcellar 9, Behind a stack of decommissioned wine racking that had not been moved in a decade, I found the wrong. It was nothing. That is the first thing to understand about the wrong. It is always nothing, until it is everything. It was a single line of mortar between two courses of ancient stone, running perhaps the length of my forearm, and it was a half shade too pale, and its surface was a half-degree too smooth. And when I laid the back of 2 fingers against it, and then against the true old mortar beside it, the false patch was a whisper warmer, the way a thing is warmer when something living runs behind it. I did not touch it again for a long moment. I stood in the pool of a distant lamp with my boring clipboard in my hand and my heart going like a drum in a stone box, and I let my face show nothing, because a man who has stood still for 19 years does not let a wall see him startle. Then I made a note about damp, a genuine note, in case any eye ever read my pages, and I marked the spot in my memory by 3 fixed points, and I climbed the long stairs back into the light, and I went about the rest of my false survey as though I had found nothing in the world but rising moisture and old fear. That night I told Princess Adela what I had found. "A patch of mortar," she repeated. We were in Isolde's study again, late, one lamp lit. She did not sound disappointed. She sounded like a woman watching a distant fire she had prayed was there confirm itself at last on the horizon. "You are certain?" "I am certain it is younger than the wall around it, and I am certain it is warmer than it should be, which means there is something behind it that draws a current. I am not certain what. To be certain, I must open it." I chose my next words with care because they mattered. "And I must tell your Highness plainly, the moment I open it, this stops being a survey. If there is a device in that wall, it may be one that tells its master when it has been disturbed. Some of them do. The instant I lay a chisel to that mortar, whoever put it there may know we are hunting. After that, we are not in a survey. We are in a race." She was quiet for the length of 3 breaths. Below the window, a single guardsman's boots rang once on the forecourt stone and were still. "How long a race?" she asked. "That depends on what I find and on how much of the house belongs to them," I said. "But if it is what we both fear, if this house has been listening to you for months, then the people who own that wall are not going to stand and let us pull it apart. They will move. They will hide or destroy or accuse. And they will move fast because a scheme survives only as long as no one can prove it exists. The proof is in that wall. Whoever owns it knows exactly how much it can hang them." I set the clipboard down on the desk between us. "I can open it tomorrow in the dark hours when the cellars are empty. But once it is open, Your Highness, there is no walking it back. We will have started something we will have to finish, and I will not start it without your word." Princess Adela looked at me for a long moment across the small pool of lamplight, in the room where her brother's first wife had lived and died, in the house that had stopped keeping its confidence, and I watched the king's sister decide to go to war. "Open the wall," she said. I opened it at 3 in the morning. I chose the hour the way a poacher chooses his. The guard changed at 2, and the next change would not come until 4. And between those 2 bells the West Range slept as deeply as a stone house ever sleeps. I went down alone with a tool roll that would have raised no eyebrow, a mason's kit, part of the damp survey, entirely in keeping with my clipboard lie, and one thing that was not in keeping, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of the roll. A small meter, borrowed from a life I did not speak of, that could taste the electricity in the air the way a dowser tastes water. I set it against the false mortar first, before I touched a chisel to anything, and it woke. The needle came off its rest and settled at a low, steady, living reading, the signature of a thing that draws a trickle of current and never stops, a thing that sips power in the dark year in and year out and gives nothing back but a voice sent somewhere else. I had seen that reading before. I had made instruments give that reading, in the life I do not speak of. It is the fingerprint of a device that listens. So before I ever lifted the mortar, I already knew. But knowing is not proof, and a princess had gone to war on the strength of my 2 fingers and a warm patch of wall, and I would not bring her a feeling. I would bring her the thing itself. I worked slowly. Speed is the enemy of the quiet trades. A hurried man makes noise, and noise carries in a stone box farther than any voice. I scored the false mortar along its edges with a fine blade until it gave up its secret, that it was not mortar at all where it mattered, but a skin of tinted plaster over a shallow lidded cavity, cut into the joint by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. Whoever had built this was no amateur with a hammer. This was patient, expert, expensive work. This was the work of someone who could command patient, expert, expensive men. The plaster lid came away in one piece into my gloved palm, and behind it, in a nest cut clean into the ancient stone of the House of Harrowgate, sat the thing I had been sent to find. I will describe it exactly, because I have been asked to describe it exactly many times since, under oath and off it, and the description has never changed. It was smaller than a matchbox. It was matte black, the deliberate lightless black of a thing built not to be seen even if seen. On its face was a fine mesh grill no larger than a fingernail, the ear. From its base ran two hair-thin wires, one that vanished up into the old conduit toward the ceiling of the cellar, toward the floor of the room above, toward the very boards under which a princess had spoken to her king, and one that ran the other way, down and sideways along the joint, threaded into the house's true wiring so cleanly that it stole the palace's own power to feed itself and rode the palace's own cables to carry its stolen voices out. It was not crude. It was not old. It was a modern listening device of a quality I had met only twice before in my life, both times in the hands of men whose trade was owning other men's secrets. I crouched there in the cold and the lamp dark, and I looked at it for a long time, and I did not touch it yet, because I understood, looking at it, that I was not looking at a crime. I was looking at the confession of one. A device like this is not planted by a jealous servant or a curious clerk. It costs. It requires access to the deepest bone of the house, the sub-cellars that had been reordered last winter under new locks, with the queen consort's own men on the keys. It requires the skill to thread a stolen wire through a palace's veins without tripping a single fuse. It requires, above all, a reason worth the ruin that its discovery would bring, and only one kind of reason is ever worth that: power. Whoever owned this ear had used it to sit invisibly at the elbow of the crown, to answer a princess's private arguments point by point, to steer the succession of a kingdom from inside its own walls. I was not holding a gadget. I was holding the handle of a knife that had been pointed at the heart of the House of Harrowgate for a year, and now, for the first time, the hand on the other end of it did not know I had my fingers around the blade. I did not pull it. That was the discipline that mattered most in the whole affair, and I wanted understood, because a lesser man would have torn the thing out of the wall in triumph and carried it up the stairs like a hunter's kill, and would have destroyed everything. Here is why I left it. A device that listens is only half a machine. The other half is wherever its stolen voice goes, the ear on the far end of the wire, the place where a man sits and hears. Pull the near end and you have a black box and a princess's word against a queen's, and the far end goes dark and vanishes and there is nothing left to trace. But leave it. Leave it whole and singing in the wall, believing itself unfound, and it becomes the very thing that will lead you home to its master. A live wire has two ends. I had found one. The other one would tell me everything. So I did a thing that took more nerve than opening the wall had. I closed it back up. I fitted the plaster lid into its cavity again, exactly as it had been. I smoothed the tinted skin. I dulled the fresh edge with a wipe of old cellar dust off the racking behind me. I put my 2 fingers against it one last time and felt the wall breathe its faint warmth, still listening, none the wiser. And then I gathered my tools and my oilcloth and my meter, and I climbed back into the sleeping house, and I left the ear exactly where its owner believed it to be safe, because a hunter does not shoot the first bird he sees. He watches where it flies. Princess Adela did not like it. "You found it and you left it," she said, when I told her at first light. There was frost on the study windows and frost in her voice. "You had the proof in your hand and you put it back in the wall." "I had half the proof in my hand," I said. "The half that hangs a servant. Your Highness, if I bring you that box, what do you have?" "A device and my oath that it was in the wall and no name attached to it. The Queen Consort will say she never saw it. She will say a foreign hand, a disgruntled tradesman, a fantasy of the king's jealous sister and her tame guard. And she will say it from a position of strength, because the moment we accuse her without the far end of the wire, she is warned, and every other thread that could hang her is cut and burned within the hour. I met the frost with the only thing that has ever answered frost, which is stillness. You did not send me to find a box. You sent me to find who put it there. The box cannot tell you that, but the wire it feeds can. Leave it live and let it lead us to the room where someone sits and listens. And then, Your Highness, you will not have a suspicion. You will have a name, a place, a hand on the earpiece, and no man alive able to call it a fantasy." The frost held for a moment longer. Then it broke, not into warmth, but into something better, respect. "You have done this before," Adela said quietly. It was not quite a question. "I have stood a post for 19 years, Your Highness," I said, which was true, and which was not an answer, and which she was clever enough to know was not an answer, and gracious enough to let lie. "Very well," she said. "Follow the wire. But understand me, Renwick, every day that box stays live in the wall, they hear this house. They may hear us plan their ruin. You are asking me to leave the knife in the wound while we hunt the hand that holds it." "Yes," I said, "that is exactly what I am asking. So from this hour, Your Highness, you and I speak of nothing that matters within any wall of this palace. Not here, not in your carriage, not in the chapel. Anywhere the wire might reach, we are two dull people discussing damp. If we are to leave the ear open, we must give it nothing worth hearing, and we must feed it once or twice something we have chosen for it to carry, so that we may see where our chosen words come out. I let that settle. That is how you catch a listener, Your Highness. Not by finding his ear, by choosing what it hears and watching who acts on it." For the first time since she had handed me the sealed card, Princess Adela smiled a real smile, thin, cold, and fierce as a blade drawn clean. "Then let us give them something to hear," she said. "Following a wire through a great house is not the clean, unspooling thing a listener imagines. The wire does not run in a straight line from the ear to the man who owns it. It hides. It shares conduits with 100 honest cables. It drops into the stone and comes up 2 rooms away. It is designed, by men who are paid well to design it, to be unfollowed. And I had to follow it while pretending to survey damp, in a house where the Queen Consort's own people held the keys to half the doors I needed to open. So for 3 days, I became a cartographer of the invisible. The sweep was my map and my mask both. By Princess Adela's order, the whole West Range was mine to crawl, fire, risk, wiring, damp, every dull pretext I could want. And I used every hour of it to trace the second wire, the one that carried the stolen voice out of Cellar 9. I could not touch it, not once, for fear of waking the box. But a live wire tells on itself to a man with a meter, the way a hidden stream tells on itself to a man with a forked stick. Where it ran, the meter felt it. Where it turned, I turned. And slowly, joint by joint, cellar by cellar, I drew in my head the path of the thing. It did not run to some foreign hand outside the walls. That was the first cruelty of what I learned. It stayed in the house. It climbed out of Cellar 9, ran the length of the West Range beneath the floors, crossed under the great forecourt and the old service conduit, and rose. I traced it rising, my meter warming as I moved my hand up the cold stone of a stairwell into the east wing. The private wing. The family's wing. The wing where, since her marriage to the king, the Queen Consort Morwenna kept her apartments. I did not let myself believe it yet. A wire that runs toward a wing is not a wire that ends in a wing, and I had put my hands on enough of these to know that the last 10 feet are where the clever men do their best lying. So I did not follow it to a door and cry treason. Instead, I did what Princess Adela and I had agreed. I baited the trap. We chose the bait together, carefully, in the one place I was certain no wire could reach, the open middle of the frozen palace garden, walking a slow circuit like an old servant and his mistress taking the air, our words carried off by the wind before any wall could catch them. The bait had to be three things. It had to sound exactly like the private, dangerous talk the listeners fed on. It had to be a lie. And it had to be a lie that, if the listeners believed it and acted on it, would betray them by the shape of their action. Here is what we chose. Princess Adela would go into Isolde's study, into the very room the ear listened to, and she would speak, as if to herself, as if reading aloud from a letter, of a document. A sealed testament, she would say. A private paper of the late Queen Isolde's, written in the last year of her life, entrusted to Adela and hidden all this while, that named certain wishes for the succession and certain warnings about certain people. A paper that Adela had at last decided the king must see, and that she would carry to him herself in person at the state reception in 6 days' time, before the whole assembled court, where no closed door could bury it. There was no such paper, but if the wall was listening, and if the one who listened feared, above all things, what the late Queen Isolde might say from beyond the grave about who should hold the House of Harrowgate, then that lie would land like a coal in dry grass. Whoever owned the ear could not let such a paper reach the king before the whole court. They would have to move to find it, to seize it, to destroy it before the reception, and in moving they would show their hand. "You are using my sister-in-law's memory as bait," Adela said, in the garden, and for the first time something in her hard face was not hard. "I am using it to catch the people who have made a listening post of her old room," I said. "Isolde would forgive us that, I think. From what I am told, she was not a woman who suffered a coward gladly." The king's sister looked out over the frozen box hedges for a long moment. "No," she said, "she was not." And then quietly, "Do it." So she did it. That evening, alone in Isolde's study, Princess Adela sat at the desk beneath the shadowed portrait and read her lie aloud to the wall, in the low, private, half-to-herself voice of a woman who believes herself unheard. She spoke of the sealed testament. She spoke of carrying it to the king before the court at the reception. She named the day. She let a silence fall, and then, as if thinking better of leaving so precious a thing in an unsafe place, she said, "This was my idea, and I am not proud of how well it worked, that until the reception she would keep the paper where no one would think to look for it. Not in her own rooms, not in any strong box, but among the estate ledgers in the old muniment room, third press, behind the household accounts of a year no thief would ever trouble to read. There was no paper in the old muniment room. There was only me, from that night onward, keeping the third press under watch through the survey's cover, waiting to see who came for a thing that did not exist. Nobody came the first night. That was correct. A careful hand does not lunge. Nobody came the second night either, and I began to wonder if the wire climbed to the east wing and died in some empty relay, if I had drawn my map wrong, if the whole thing was after all a princess's draft and a guard's ghost. On the third night someone came. I was in the gallery above the old muniment room, in the deep shadow of a pillar where the survey had given me every right to be and the dark gave me every advantage, and at a little past 1 in the morning the door below opened without a lamp. That was the tell. An honest errand carries a light. This one came in the dark, feeling its way, a shape that knew the room well enough to cross it blind straight to the third press. I heard the small sounds of it. The press opened, the ledgers shifted, quick and quiet and expert, a searching that grew less quiet and more urgent as the paper that should have been there refused to be found. I heard a sharp breath of frustration. I heard the ledgers pushed roughly back, and then the shape crossed to the window, where the thin gray light of the winter moon fell for one moment across a face, and I saw who had come to steal the letter of a dead queen. It was not the queen consort Morwenna. Of course it was not. A queen does not crawl through muniment rooms at 1 in the morning. She has people for that. It was one of her people, and I knew him. Everyone in the House of Harrowgate knew him. He was a smooth, soft-handed, well-tailored man named Lord Cassius, and he was the queen consort's son by her first marriage, and he had spent the 2 years since his mother's wedding making himself indispensable to the running of the private household, and I had never once, in all that time, seen him in a room where he could not have been the most powerful man present. Now he stood in the old muniment room in the dark with a dead woman's ledgers in his hands and frustration on his face, and he had told me, more surely than any confession, 3 things at once: that the wall was listening, that its stolen voice climbed to the east wing, as my meter had said, and that the hand which moved when the ear was fed sat very, very close to the queen consort of Eldermore. I did not move. I did not breathe loud enough for a moth to hear. I watched Lord Cassius stand a moment longer in his failure, and then gather himself, and slip back out through the dark door as quietly as he had come. And when he was gone and the house was still, I let out a long breath into the cold, and I understood that Princess Adela had been right about everything, and that we were no longer hunting a ghost. We were hunting a queen's son, and a queen's son is never hunted alone. I told Princess Adela in the garden the next morning, walking the frozen circuit, our words torn off by the wind. She took the name of Lord Cassius the way a soldier takes a blow he has braced for without flinching and without relief. So it is her circle, she said. It is what I feared and worse than I feared, because Cassius is not the mind of it. Cassius is the hand. He does what he is told, and he does it smoothly, and he has never in his life had an idea that did not come down to him from his mother's chair. She stopped walking. If Cassius came for the letter, then the ear that heard my lie carried it up to Morwenna's rooms, and Morwenna sent her son to find the thing that frightened her. That is the chain, Renwick, but a chain is not a court. I have a princess's certainty. I still do not have a thing I can lay before the king that his own love cannot argue away. She was right, and it was the hardest truth of the whole affair. Because here is the thing about a listening scheme. The ear is deniable, and the hand is deniable, and even the master is deniable, so long as no one can prove that the 3 are one machine. Morwenna could disown the box in the wall. She could disown her son's midnight errand as some private folly of his own. What I needed was the middle of the machine, the place where the stolen voice came out of the wall and into a human ear, the room where someone actually sat and listened, with the earpiece in his hand and the wire in his fist and no possible innocent reason to be doing it. Find that room, catch the listener in the act, and the whole chain from cellar to consort locks shut and cannot be broken. So I stopped following the wire toward the east wing, and I started thinking like the man who owned it. A listener needs a room, not the queen consort's own apartments, far too dangerous. A queen cannot have a wire running visibly into her sitting room. He needs a quiet, forgettable room, near enough to the east wing to be convenient, private enough that no servant wanders in, with a plausible everyday reason for someone of the household to spend hours there unremarked. And he needs it to be a room where a listener can sit for hours with an earpiece, and a machine to record what the ear brings him. Because no man listens to a whole palace live. He records and reviews and reports the parts that matter. I found it on the 5th day, and I found it the way I had found everything, by looking for the wrong. There is off a half-forgotten corridor between the east wing and the old library, a room that the household books call the second correspondence office. Once, generations back, it was where clerks answered the flood of a queen's letters. For years it had been all but disused, a place of dust sheets and stacked chairs. But when I walked past it on my survey rounds, with my meter quiet in my pocket and my eyes doing the true work, I saw the wrong at once. The dust sheets were too clean. The lock on the door was new, the same bright, expensive, out-of-place new as the locks the queen consort had put on the cellars last winter. And under the door, at odd hours, showed the thin gray line of a light that had no business burning in a disused office at 10 at night. I did not force the door. I did better than that. I read the household roster, and I learned who held the key to the second correspondence office, and the name on the key was not Lord Cassius, and it was not the Queen Consort. It was a woman named Lady Verena. I knew her a little, as everyone in the house knew her a little. Lady Verena was the Queen Consort's daughter, Cassius's sister, Morwenna's child by the same first marriage, a poised, watchful, clever young woman who moved through the court saying very little, and I now understood, hearing a very great deal. She was the Queen Consort's private secretary in all but name. And she had, of all the people in the House of Harrowgate, the one thing the listener most needed: a perfect, unremarkable reason to sit for hours behind a locked door doing quiet, papery work that no one would ever interrupt. There it was, then, the whole machine laid out in my head at last, the ear in the cellar wall, the wire climbing the house, the listening room off the old library, its light burning at odd hours, its key in the hand of the Queen Consort's daughter, the hand Cassius who moved when the ear was fed, and above all three in the east wing, the Queen Consort Morwenna, whom none of them served but her. I had the machine, now I had to catch it running. There was one more thing I learned in those days of tracing, and I set it down here because it is the thing that decided me, in the end, more than any wire or any lock, that this scheme had to be pulled up by the root and not merely snipped off at the wall. On the 6th day of the sweep, still in my surveyor's disguise, I had caused to pass through the family's own corridor in the east wing, a fire-risk inspection of the old paneling, entirely genuine, entirely dull. And I came upon a scene that stopped me in my tracks, though I did not let my step show it. In a window seat at the end of the corridor sat the Crown Prince Rowan with his youngest, Prince Bram, a small serious boy of 6, and the 3 older grandchildren of the house drifting near, and they were doing nothing at all, only talking, the ordinary golden nothing of a father and his children on a gray winter morning. The prince was telling some small story. The children were laughing. And it struck me like a hand laid flat on the chest that every word of that laughter, every private and tender and unguarded thing said in the rooms of that wing, had for a year been draining down a wire in the wall into a black box on a table in a locked office, to be spooled and reviewed and reported to a woman who would use whatever she found. That was the whole horror of it, laid plain. It was not only the king's counsels of state that had been stolen. It was this, the ordinary sanctuary of a family that believed its own walls kept faith with it, a scheme that would put a listening wire into the room where a father tells his small son a story on a gray morning is not a scheme you snip off at the wall and leave the schemer to try again. It is a scheme you tear out to the very hand that planted it, so that it can never grow back. I had come down into the cellars looking for a device. I understood now that I was really looking for the thing that would let a family speak freely in its own house again, and that could not be done by pulling one box. It could only be done by catching and naming and ending the whole machine. I stood in that corridor for one moment longer than my survey needed, watching the Crown Prince and his children in their unguarded, unknowing peace. Then I made a genuine note about the old paneling, and I went on, and I did not let a single face in that wing see that anything at all had changed in the invisible warrant officer with the clipboard. But something had. Until that morning I had been solving a puzzle. After it, I was righting a wrong. "You mean to break into a locked room in the king's own house," Princess Adela said flatly, "in the garden, and lay hands on the Queen Consort's daughter, on the word of a warrant officer, 4 days before a state reception. If you are wrong by a hair's breadth, Renwick, they will have your commission and my credit both, and this house will close over the whole affair like water over a stone." "I do not mean to break into anything, Your Highness," I said. "A locked door is a queen's word against ours all over again. I mean to make the listener open her own door, in front of witnesses she cannot dismiss, holding the very earpiece in her hand, so that there is nothing left to argue. And for that, I need 3 things from you, and none of them are easy." "Name them." "First, the king, not told everything, not yet, but placed. On the morning I choose, I need His Majesty to be somewhere he can be reached within minutes, with men of the guard he trusts about him, and I need him willing to walk into a room when his sister sends for him, and to trust what he sees there with his own eyes. You are the only soul alive who can arrange that without warning the wall." Adela's jaw tightened. "You are asking me to bring my brother to the door of his own wife's treason and let him find it there." "I am asking you to let him find the truth with his own eyes rather than have it argued into his ears," I said. "It is the only door he will walk back out of still able to rule. If we accuse Morwenna and are proven right in some quiet chamber after the fact, the house survives, but the king never trusts anyone again, least of all the sister who accused his wife. If he sees it himself, the wire, the room, the listener at her work, then it is not his sister's word against his wife's. It is simply the truth, and even a king in love cannot argue with a wire in a woman's hand." I paused. "The second thing I need is one guardsman besides myself, one I can swear by. Because I will not lay a hand on a highborn woman alone in a locked room in the dark and give them the story they want, of a rogue guard and a frightened lady. There must be two of us, both witnesses, both above reproach." "You have him," Adela said at once. "Take Osric, he stood at my father's coffin. He would let them break both his arms before he told a lie to save himself. What is the third thing?" I hesitated, because the third thing was the one that could ruin us. "The third thing," I said, "is that we must feed the ear one last time. A larger lie than the letter. A lie so urgent that the listener cannot merely report it and wait for orders. A lie that forces her to sit at her post that very morning, earpiece in hand, listening live, because the thing she hears will be unfolding in real time, and she will not dare miss a word of it." I met the king's sister's level eyes. "We must make the queen consort's daughter want, more than anything in the world, to be listening to Isolde's old study at 10 o'clock on the morning of the day before the reception. And then at 10 o'clock we must open her door." The wind moved the frozen hedges. Somewhere across the garden, a single crow lifted off a wall and beat away into the gray. "And if she is not there?" Adela asked. "If the room is empty and the wire is cold and I have brought my brother to nothing?" "Then I have failed you, your highness," I said, "and I will lay down my commission the same hour and never trouble your house again. But she will be there." I looked up at the great gray face of the palace, at its 100 windows, at the one dark room behind one of them where a light burned at odd hours. "She will be there, because we are about to offer her the one thing every listener in the history of the world has been unable to resist. We are going to promise her a secret. And then we are going to let her think she is about to hear it stolen out from under her. Unless she listens very, very closely, at 10 o'clock, alone, with the door locked and the earpiece pressed to her head." For a long moment Princess Adela said nothing. Then she drew her cloak tighter against the cold, and when she spoke, her voice had in it something I had not heard from her before, not command, and not fear, but the grim, quiet hope of a woman who has carried a suspicion alone for a year and now, at last, sees a way to set it down. "Tell me exactly what to say," she said, "and where to stand and when. And God help the three of them, Renwick. Because if this works, my brother is going to walk into that room and find out that the woman he married has been sitting in the dark of his own house, listening to every word he ever thought was private. And I do not know a grief in the world sharper than that one." "No," I said, "nor do I, but it is a cleaner grief than a lie he never learns. Let us give the king the truth. It is the only honest gift left to give him." The plan nearly died the night before I could spring it, and it nearly died because of the one thing no listener strap can account for, the human heart of the people you are hunting. Late that evening, doing my last rounds under the survey's cover, I passed the mouth of the corridor that led to the second correspondence office, and I heard voices where there should have been none. Two of them, low and urgent. I put my back to the cold stone in the dark, and I did not breathe, and I listened to the listeners. It was Cassius and Verena, the son and the daughter, and they were afraid. "Too much," Verena was saying, and her poised court voice had cracked down the middle. The letter, the reception. Cassius, she is going to carry it to the king in front of the whole court. Mother says we take it before then, but I am telling you the thing frightens me. We were meant to listen. We were never meant to." She stopped. "It has gone too far. I want it out of the wall. I want it out of the wall before the reception, before someone finds it, and I want to be 1,000 miles from this house." "You want," Cassius said, and there was contempt in it, and there was fear under the contempt. "What we want stopped mattering the day Mother put the first man on the cellar keys. You think we can pull the thing out now? You think she lets us? We are in it to the throat, Verena, all three of us, and the only way out is through. Find the letter, destroy it, and keep listening, because if that woman so much as breathes a word that gives us away before the reception, we need to hear it in time to." "To what?" Verena's voice was very small. "To what, Cassius? There is no to what. There is only worse and worse. I did not sign on to spy on the king. I signed on to help Mother keep her place. And now I sit in the dark with a machine, and I hear that man grieve for his first wife when he thinks no one can hear him, and I hear his sister try to protect his children, and I am the villain of it. I am the thing under the floor." A silence. "I want out." I stood in the dark, and I will tell you honestly what I felt, because I have never been the kind of man to dress up a night like that one. I felt the whole plan tremble. Because if Verena lost her nerve tonight, if she went to that room and tore the box out of the wall and fled, then the ear went dark, the machine came out of the wall in pieces, and I was left with a princess's certainty and no listener to catch, and the whole chain fell apart in my hands the very night before I could close it. The false dawn is the moment the hunted almost save themselves, and it very nearly happened, not because they were clever, but because one of them had a conscience that had run out of room. And here is the thing I did that I have thought about many times since. I did not stop them. I did not step out of the dark and arrest a frightened woman before her crime was finished, on the strength of an overheard fear. That would have been the same failure as pulling the box from the wall, a half-proof, a scene, a story they could bend. Instead, I let them go on being afraid, and I went quietly back to Princess Adela, and I told her that our window had shrunk to a knife's edge, that Verena wanted out, that the machine might not survive the night, and that we could not wait for the morning I had planned. We had to spring the trap now, tomorrow at dawn, before Lady Verena's nerve finished failing and took our only proof out of the wall with it. "Then we move at dawn," Adela said, and to her eternal credit she did not blink. "I will have my brother. God grant we are ready." We were not ready. We were never going to be ready. But readiness is a luxury of men who are not hunting queens, and we did what we could with the night we had. I woke Osric, the gray old guardsman who had stood at a king's coffin, and I told him only what he needed and trusted him with the rest, and he heard me out with his lined face still as stone, and at the end he said just this: "If it is treason against the king's peace, Renwick, then I do not care whose daughter she is. Wake me an hour before the bell." Then he went back to sleep, because a soldier of 40 years' service sleeps when he can, and I sat up the rest of the night going over every stone of it in my head, walking every stone as a princess had ordered me to, one last time. At first light, Princess Adela did the last and largest thing I had asked of her. She went into Isolde's study, into the very room the ear listened to, and alone, in her low private voice, she read her last lie to the wall. She said that she had been betrayed, that she had learned only this hour that someone in the house knew of Isolde's sealed testament and meant to seize it before the reception, that she dared not leave it another hour in the old muniment room, that she was going, right now, this morning at 10 o'clock, to move the paper with her own hands to a strongbox in her private apartments, and that she would read it through one final time in the study first, aloud, to be certain of its contents, before she carried it away forever beyond any thief's reach. 10 o'clock, in the study, reading the fatal paper aloud. It was bait no listener on earth could refuse. If Verena's nerve had truly gone, she might have run. But I had gambled everything, and I had gambled it on the one line of hers I could not stop hearing. I hear that man grieve for his first wife when he thinks no one can hear him. A woman who could not stop listening even when it broke her heart was not a woman who could make herself go deaf at 10 o'clock while the whole secret of the house was read aloud into her ear. She would tell herself it was the last time. She would tell herself she needed to hear it to know how to run. And she would sit at her post, earpiece in hand, door locked, at 10 o'clock and listen. At 9:30 I was in the corridor outside the second correspondence office, in the shadow, with old Osric like a slab of granite at my shoulder and my heart perfectly, coldly still. At 9:45, the thin gray line of light showed under the door. She was there. At 9:55 I heard, very faintly through the old wood, the small metal sound of a machine being made ready and the creak of a chair drawn close. And at 10 o'clock, when I knew that in Isolde's study a floor and a wing away Princess Adela had begun to read aloud from a paper that did not exist. I knew it because I had told her to begin at the stroke of the hour, and the great clock on the forecourt was striking it now. At 10 o'clock, when the listener behind that door would have the stolen voice of a princess pouring hot and live into her ear, and every scrap of her attention nailed to it. I sent word up the east stair by a runner Adela had placed, and I put my hand on the door, and I did not knock. I had in my breast pocket the key, not Verena's key, mine. Because 2 days before, under the survey, I had taken the measure of that new expensive lock the way I had once been trained to take the measure of locks, and I had a key that turned it, and Lady Verena did not know that the one door in the house she trusted most had, for 2 days, not truly been locked against me at all. I turned the key. The bolt gave without a sound, and with old Osric a half-step behind me as my witness, I opened the door of the second correspondence office at 10 in the morning, and I walked in on the listener at her work. She was exactly as I had known she would be, and it was worse than I had imagined. Lady Verena sat at a plain table in that dust-sheeted room with her back half to the door, and on the table before her stood the other half of the machine I had found in the cellar wall, a matte black relay no larger than a book, wires running out of the wainscot behind it, feeding into it the stolen life of the House of Harrowgate. There was a recorder turning slow and silent beside it. And pressed to Lady Verena's ear, held there by her own white-knuckled hand, was the earpiece, out of which, at that very moment, poured the low, private, live voice of Princess Adela, a floor and a wing away, reading a paper that did not exist into a room she believed empty of everyone but herself. Lady Verena did not hear the door. She could not. She had the whole secret of the house in her ear, and she had chosen it in that moment over everything, exactly as I had gambled she would. She was so deep in the stolen voice that she did not know the world had come in behind her until my shadow fell across her table. She turned, and I have stood a good many posts and seen a good many faces do a good many things, but I have never seen a human face fall as far or as fast as Lady Verena's fell in the instant she understood what my being in that room meant. The earpiece was still in her hand. The princess's voice was still pouring out of it, small and tinny in the sudden silence, so that every soul in the room could hear that it was real, that it was live, that it was the private speech of the king's sister carried out of a locked study by a wire in the wall. There was no arguing it. There was no fantasy of a jealous sister and her tame guard. There was only a woman with a queen's house stolen into her fist, caught in the very act, with the proof still speaking in her hand. Lady Verena, I said quietly because there was no need to be otherwise, put it down. She put it down. Her hand was shaking. The small, tinny voice of Princess Adela went on for a moment more from the fallen earpiece on the table, went on reading its lie to a listener who was no longer listening, until I reached past her and, gently, switched the machine off, and the House of Harrowgate stopped being overheard for the first time in a year. "You are Renwick," she said. Her poise was gone. There was only a young woman in a cold room with the ruin of her whole life laid out on the table in front of her. The surveyor, the damp, a terrible small laugh. You were never the damp at all." "No, my lady," I said. "I was walking every stone." Behind me, Osric had taken his station in the doorway, granite and silent, a witness no court in the kingdom could wave away. And I heard then the thing I had been waiting for above every other: boots on the east stair. Many boots, and among them, unhurried, the particular tread of a man who has never in his life had to hurry because the world has always waited for him. The king came into the second correspondence office at 10:04 in the morning, and his sister was at his shoulder. I had asked Princess Adela for one thing above all others, that the king find the truth with his own eyes rather than have it argued into his ears. And so it happened. King Alaric stopped in the doorway of that shabby, secret room, and he looked at the machine on the table, and the wires in the wall, and the recorder, and the fallen earpiece, and the face of Lady Verena, Morwenna's daughter, his own wife's child, and I watched a king who had ruled 40 years and buried a wife and married again understand in perfect silence, without a single word from me, exactly what he was looking at. He did not need it explained. A man does not need treason explained to him when it is laid out on a table in his own house. "Play it," the king said. His voice was very quiet. I moved to the recorder and I turned it back, and I let the machine speak in its own defense. Out of it came the House of Harrowgate as it had been stolen, Princess Adela's voice, private and unguarded, and further back other voices, dozens of them, weeks of them, and among them unmistakable the king's own voice, speaking in what he had believed to be the sanctuary of a locked study, grieving, deciding, trusting. Every private word he had thought his own, sitting on a spool of tape in his wife's daughter's hand. King Alaric listened to perhaps a minute of it. Then he raised one hand, and I stopped the machine, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever stood inside. "How long?" the king said. He was not looking at me. He was looking at Lady Verena. "How long has this house had ears?" Lady Verena's nerve, which had failed her in the corridor the night before, did the one honorable thing left to it. She did not lie to her king. "Since last winter, your majesty," she said. Her voice was steady now, the steadiness of a person past all hope of saving herself. "When the cellars were relocked, she stopped, and I watched her stand at the last crossroads of her life and choose. It was my mother's design. Cassius placed the device. I listened and I reported to her what I heard. I will not pretend I was made to. I could have refused, and I did not, and I have sat in that chair for a year and heard things no soul should hear, and told myself it was loyalty." She lifted her chin, and there were tears standing in her eyes that she would not let fall. "It was not loyalty, your majesty. It was theft. We stole your house out from under you a word at a time, and I am glad, God help me, I am glad that it is over. They found Lord Cassius within the hour. He had already begun to run. A man like Cassius always knows when the ground has gone out from under him, a half-day before it does. But the House of Harrowgate does not have many roads out of it, and every one of them that morning had a guardsman on it who had been quietly placed there before dawn by a warrant officer doing a damp survey. They took him at the eastern gate with a traveling case in his hand, and in the case, folded small, a set of the same fine wires that ran in the cellar wall. He argued. Men like Cassius always argue. But there is not much a man can argue when his own sister has already told the king everything, and the machine is on the table, and the king himself has heard his own stolen voice played back to him in a cold gray room. The queen consort Morwenna did not run. I will grant her that. When the king went to her apartments in the east wing, and he went himself, alone but for his sister and 2 guardsmen, because that was a thing he would not send another man to do, she was waiting for him, and she had dressed with care, and she met him standing. What passed between them behind that door I do not know and would not repeat if I did. Some griefs belong to the man who bears them and to no one else. But I know what came out of it, because the whole house came to know, and it was this. The king did not rage. A lesser man would have raged. A wiser man grieves, and King Alaric was, in the end, a wise man who had let himself be a foolish one for love, and had now been cured of the folly in the cruelest possible way. He did not have his wife dragged through the courts to be the spectacle of the realm. He did the harder, cleaner thing. By his own hand that same day, the Queen Consort Morwenna was stripped of her office and her honors, removed from the House of Harrowgate, and sent to live out her years under quiet guard on a distant estate, permitted to keep her title and nothing of its power, forbidden the court and the capital and the presence of the king for the rest of her life. Lord Cassius answered to the law for the placing of the device and the theft of the crown's private counsels, and the law was not gentle with him. Lady Verena, because she had confessed freely, because she had wanted out before the end, because the king is a just man and justice remembers the difference between the hand that repents and the hand that does not, was sent away also, but not disgraced past all mending. She lives quietly now, far from the house, and I am told she has never once, in all the years since, spoken an unkind word of the king who spared her more than she deserved. And the ear in the cellar wall came out at last. I took it out myself, that afternoon, with the king's own leave and Princess Adela watching, pried the little matte black box from its nest in the ancient stone of Sub-Cellar 9, and cut its stolen wire, and carried it up the long stairs into the light, and laid it on the table before the king. It was such a small thing to have done so much harm. They mostly are. "You left it in the wall," the king said to me, turning the dead device over in his fingers. "You found it on the third day, my sister tells me, and you left it there another 8, and you let this house be overheard 8 days longer than you needed to, so that it would lead you to the room and the hand." He looked up at me, and his eyes were tired and level and altogether a king's. "Do you know what it cost me, Renwick, those 8 days? Do you know what was overheard?" "I can guess some of it, your majesty," I said, "and I have thought about those 8 days a great deal. If I had pulled the box the hour I found it, I would have brought your sister a nameless machine and no proof of the hand behind it, and the ones who placed it would have burned every other thread and stood before you innocent, and you would have spent the rest of your reign not knowing whom in your own house to trust. I judged that 8 days of a listening you already suffered unknowing was a smaller price than a lifetime of that doubt. It was not my grief to spend, your majesty, and I spent it. And if you find it was too dear a price, then I will answer for it however you see fit." The king looked at me for a long moment. Then he set the dead device down on the table. "No," he said, "you judged rightly. A wound cleaned all the way to the bottom heals. A wound closed over dirt festers for years. You cleaned it to the bottom." He was silent a moment. "Ask me for something, Renwick. It is not the custom, I know, and you are the sort of man who will say he wants nothing, and I am telling you to ask anyway. A house that has been robbed as mine has been robbed pays its honest servants what it can." I thought about it, and I will tell you what I asked for, because people are always surprised by it, and because it is the truest thing about me that this whole affair ever put on show. "Let me go back to my post, your majesty," I said. "That is all. Let this be forgotten and my name with it, and let me stand my wall again as though none of it had ever happened. I am no good to you as a famous man. I was only ever any good to you because no one bothered to watch the invisible warrant officer." I paused. "And keep the sweeps, your majesty. Not once. Twice a year, quietly, ordinary and boring, every stone. A house that has been listened to once should never again be careless of its walls." The king almost smiled. It was the first almost smile I had seen on him that whole gray day. "Twice a year," he agreed. "Every stone, and you will run them." He picked up the dead black box one last time and closed his fist around it. "The rest I grant you. Go back to your post, Renwick, and know that you will stand it a good deal easier than you did before, because this house keeps its confidence again, and it keeps it because of you." So I went back to my wall. I would like to tell you that everything was mended, and it was not all of it. A king who has been overheard grieving for his first wife does not ungrieve, and a house that has been robbed of its trust does not buy it all back in a single day. But the ear was out of the wall, and the hand that owned it was gone from the court, and the mind that had schemed it lived out her days far away with her title and her guards and nothing else. The state reception went on as though nothing had happened, and half the court, and the ambassadors, and the press behind their ropes, saw a House of Harrowgate that stood as straight and proud and confident of itself as it ever had, and only a handful of us knew what it had cost, in the dark, in the cellars, to make it so. Princess Adela came to me once more, a week after, in the frozen garden where we had done our real talking. She did not thank me in words. She was not a woman for whom warmth came easily, and I would have distrusted it if it had. She simply walked the circuit beside me for a while in silence, and at the end of it she said, "You walked every stone. You ordered it, Your Highness." "I ordered a sweep," she said. "I did not know I was ordering the saving of my brother's house. I do not think you knew it either that first night when I handed you the card." She looked out over the gray hedges, and the crow lifted off the wall again, the way it always did, and beat away into the cold. Most men, given that card, would have found the box and been a hero for an hour. You found the box and put it back and became nothing at all for 11 days, so that you could catch the whole of it. That is a rarer thing than courage, Renwick. Most people cannot bear to be nobody long enough to do the great thing. You can. "It is the whole of my trade, Your Highness," I said, "standing still, being nobody, not moving until it matters. And when it matters—" I thought of the door I had opened at 10:01, and the listener at her work, and the small tinny voice of a princess pouring out of a fallen earpiece into a room that had, at last, been caught. "When it matters," I said, "I walk every stone." She nodded once, the winter version of everything a warmer woman would have said, and she left me there in the garden. And I went back to the wall, and I stood my post, and above my bearskin the 100 windows of the House of Harrowgate looked down gray and quiet, and at last, honestly empty of any ear that should not be there. A house that kept its own counsel again, in the deep bone of its cellars and the high glass of its galleries alike, because one invisible man had been told to walk every stone, and had walked them, all the way down to the wrong.